The tray of champagne glasses shattered first. Then came the scream, short, sharp, swallowed almost instantly by her own hand pressed hard against her mouth. Grace Delgado stood frozen in a doorway she was never supposed to open, staring at a man who was not supposed to be seen by anyone. Steam still curled off his shoulders from the shower. A towel hung low on his hips. A long, pale scar cut across his ribs like a signature written in violence. And his eyes, dark, still, terrifyingly calm, locked onto hers with the kind of stillness that comes right before something breaks. Nobody in that hotel knew his real name. They called him Mr. Kong. Some called him something else, in whispers, behind closed doors, when they thought no one else could hear, the ghost. Grace did not know any of that. All she knew, in that frozen half-second, was that she had walked through the wrong door looking for a missing box of table centerpieces, and now a stranger's hand was moving towards something on the nightstand, something metal, something that caught the light. "Please," she whispered, stumbling back. "I didn't see anything. I swear, I didn't see anything." He didn't move for 3 full seconds. 3 seconds that felt like 3 years. Then, low and controlled, he said the words that would change both their lives forever. "Sit down. And don't you dare think about running. If your heart just skipped a beat, that's exactly where this story wants you." Before we go any further, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because this story has twists you will not see coming, and you do not want to miss a single second of what happens next. 9 months earlier, Grace Delgado's life looked nothing like a thriller. It looked like exhaustion. It looked like spreadsheets open at midnight, a 5-year-old asleep in the next room with an oxygen monitor clipped gently to his finger, and a stack of hospital bills she read over and over as if the numbers might change if she just stared hard enough. Her son, Mateo, had been diagnosed with leukemia when he was 3. He was 5 now, and in remission, and every single day of that remission had a price tag attached to it that Grace could not fully pay. She worked as an event coordinator at the Palacio Grand, one of the most prestigious hotels in Los Angeles, the kind of place where a single wedding budget could cover a family's rent for 2 years. She organized galas for people whose lives she could not imagine, cleaned up their spilled wine, remembered their allergies, smiled through their impatience, and went home every night to count coins for co-pays. She was good at her job. She was good at disappearing into the background of other people's important nights. She had learned, out of necessity, how to move quietly through a room, how to notice everything without being noticed herself. It was a skill that had kept her employed for 6 years. It was also, unknowingly, the exact skill that was about to put her in more danger than she had ever known. Her coworkers liked her, mostly. Her supervisor, a sharp-tongued woman named Denise, tolerated her because Grace never complained, never called in sick even when she should have, and always found a way to fix problems before they became disasters. "You're a magician, Delgado," Denise used to say. "Whatever's broken, you fix it quiet." I like quiet. Grace didn't feel like a magician. She felt like a woman running on fumes, holding a family together with tape and prayer, one crisis away from losing everything. The diagnosis had come on a Tuesday, of all the ordinary days for a world to end. Mateo had been running a fever for a week that wouldn't break, bruises appearing on his shins that Grace assumed came from playground tumbles, until a pediatrician's face changed in a way that pediatricians are trained never to let happen in front of a parent. Acute lymphoblastic leukemia. 3 simple words that rearranged every plan Grace had ever made for her son's life. She remembered almost nothing about the drive home from that first appointment except gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles went white, and pulling into a gas station parking lot 2 blocks from her apartment because she physically could not make herself keep driving while crying that hard. She sat there for 20 minutes, forehead against the wheel, and then wiped her face, checked the mirror to make sure her eyes didn't look too red, and drove the rest of the way home, because Mateo was waiting for her, and Mateo could never see her fall apart. Not once. Not ever, if she could help it. That had become the architecture of her life ever since, falling apart quietly, in gas station parking lots and hospital bathroom stalls in the 15 minutes after Mateo fell asleep, and then rebuilding herself, piece by piece, every single morning, into someone steady enough for a 5-year-old to lean on. Her coworker Priya, who ran the flower arrangements for most of the hotel's big events, was the only person at the Palacio Grand who knew the full truth of what Grace was carrying. They'd bonded 2 years earlier over a ruined seating chart and a shared bottle of terrible breakroom coffee, and somewhere in that late night of fixing someone else's wedding disaster, Grace had let something slip about a hospital bill she couldn't cover, and Priya, instead of pitying her, had simply said, "Okay. What do you need?" and meant it. "You look like hell today," Priya told her one afternoon, 3 weeks before the Whitmore Gala, setting down a tray of white orchids destined for a table Grace hadn't finished arranging. "More than usual hell. What's going on?" "Insurance denied the follow-up scan again," Grace said, not looking up from her clipboard. "Said it wasn't medically necessary since he's technically in remission. I have to appeal it, which means 3 weeks of phone calls to people who read from scripts, which means 3 weeks of not knowing if my son's cancer is actually gone or just quiet. Grace. I'm fine. I'll figure it out. I always figure it out." "You always figure it out," Priya repeated, quieter, "because you never let yourself stop moving long enough to fall apart where anyone could catch you. One of these days, you're going to have to let somebody catch you." Grace had laughed that off at the time, the particular laugh of a woman who has decided, consciously or not, that needing help is a luxury she cannot afford. She had no idea, standing in that flower-scented hallway 3 weeks before everything changed, how literally true Priya's words were about to become, or who, exactly, would end up being the one who caught her. She had no idea that the hotel had, for the past 18 months, been secretly hosting one of the most powerful men on the West Coast for private business meetings, a man who used the Palacio Grand's top-floor suite not for luxury, but for privacy. A man whose name did not appear on any official document, whose company, Kong International Trading, looked, on paper, like nothing more than a mid-sized import-export business dealing in electronics and textiles. On paper. In reality, Min Jun Kong controlled a network that stretched from Seoul to Los Angeles to Vancouver, a network built by his father and inherited by him at the age of 26, when a car explosion in Incheon took both of his parents in the same breath. He had spent 16 years since then building walls around himself, walls of money, walls of silence, walls of people who owed him too much to ever betray him. Or so he believed. 3 weeks before Grace opened the wrong door, someone inside Kang's inner circle had begun leaking information to a rival family, the choice, old enemies of his father, hungry to reclaim territory they'd lost a decade earlier. 2 shipments had been intercepted. 1 safe house had been raided. A courier had gone missing and turned up 2 days later in a manner too brutal to describe on camera. Kang did not know who the traitor was. He only knew that someone close to him, someone trusted, was selling him out piece by piece. And a man who has spent his whole life surviving on control does not respond well to losing it. The night of the Whitmore Foundation Charity Gala started, like most disasters, with something small. A wedding party, not the gala itself, but a smaller reception booked in a side ballroom on the same evening, had been promised 120 gold-rimmed centerpieces by 6 o'clock, and at 5:45, exactly none of them had arrived at their assigned tables. The bride's mother, a woman named Sandra Whitfield who had flown in relatives from 4 states and was not, by any stretch, in the mood for improvisation, found Grace near the coat check and gripped her forearm with the particular strength of a mother whose daughter's wedding day was, in her mind, actively catching fire. "Where are my centerpieces?" Sandra said, each word its own separate sentence. "I'm handling it right now," Grace said, already moving, already scanning her radio, already running the mental map of every storage room in a building she had memorized down to the inch over 6 years. "I promise you, Mrs. Whitfield, your daughter's tables will be perfect by the time the first guest sits down. You said that 40 minutes ago. And I meant it 40 minutes ago too. Give me 15 minutes. She didn't have 15 minutes to spare, not really, not with the main gala also beginning to fill the grand ballroom 2 floors below, 400 guests in gowns and tuxedos moving through a lobby that needed to look effortless even though nothing about producing effortlessness had ever, in Grace's experience, been effortless. She radioed the loading dock. Nothing. She radioed the banquet storage room on the second floor. Nothing. She checked the inventory log on her tablet and found a note, scrawled by a temp worker 2 shifts ago in handwriting she could barely decipher, mentioning overflow storage moved to TF, North Wing during a renovation the previous month. TF. Top floor. Grace had worked at the Palacio Grand for 6 years and had never once had reason to go to the top floor. It wasn't part of any event space. It functioned, as far as she understood, as a private wing reserved for long-term corporate guests, the kind of arrangement made far above her pay grade and never explained to staff who didn't need to know. But 120 centerpieces and a bride's mother with murder in her eyes were not going to wait for an explanation. She took the service elevator up, her heels echoing against marble in a hallway far quieter and far more expensively decorated than anything 2 floors below. No signage. No room numbers she recognized from any event she'd ever worked. Just a long corridor of unmarked doors, dim gold sconces, and a silence so complete it made the hair on her arms rise before she understood why. She tried the first door. Locked. The second. Locked. A voice in the back of her mind, the same voice that had kept her alive and employed for 6 years by knowing exactly which doors were hers to open, told her, quietly, that she probably shouldn't be up here at all. She ignored it, because Sandra Whitfield's grip was still a phantom ache on her forearm, and because in 6 years she had never once failed to solve a problem, and she was not about to start tonight. The third door was unlocked. She pushed it open, already speaking before she'd fully stepped inside. "Sorry, I'm just looking for some overflow inventory. There should be some boxes marked," and the sentence died in her throat the instant she registered the room in front of her, the steam, the low light, the man standing there with his back partially turned, and the sound, an instant later, of a tray of champagne glasses someone had left balanced on a side table crashing to the marble floor as her elbow caught it in her. Panicked to step back. The single largest event the Palacio Grand hosted all year, and the night Kong had chosen for a private, off-the-books meeting with 2 associates on the top floor, believing the noise and chaos of 400 wealthy guests below would be the perfect cover for a conversation that could never be overheard. He was wrong about one thing. He hadn't accounted for a missing shipment of gold-rimmed centerpieces, a frantic bride's mother, and an event coordinator who took her job seriously enough to search every service corridor and unmarked door in a building she'd worked in for 6 years, including one door on the top floor that was never, ever supposed to be used that night. If you're already holding your breath for what happens next, drop a comment below and let us know. Have you ever been somewhere you weren't supposed to be, at exactly the wrong time? Keep watching, because this story is about to take a turn that changes everything. "Sit down," Kong repeated, quieter this time, but somehow more frightening for it. "Now." Grace's legs moved before her mind caught up, lowering her into the velvet chair by the window because some ancient, animal part of her understood that this was not a moment for defiance. Her hands were shaking so badly she had to press them flat against her knees to stop the tremor. Kong pulled a shirt on over his head without hurry, without breaking eye contact, the scar disappearing beneath dark fabric. 2 men entered from the adjoining room at the sound of the crash, big men, silent men, the kind whose presence alone rearranged the air in a space. One of them, older, with a face like carved stone, reached instinctively for something inside his jacket. "No," Kong said sharply, holding up a hand. The man stopped. "Sir, she could be." I said no, Tae-sung. His voice did not rise, but something in it made the room go still. "Not until I understand what happened." He turned back to Grace. "Who sent you?" "Nobody sent me," Grace said, her voice breaking. "I work here. I'm the event coordinator downstairs. There's a wedding party missing their centerpieces, and I was told there was extra inventory stored up here on this floor, and I opened the wrong door. I swear to God, I opened the wrong door. Do you know who I am?" "No. I've never seen you before in my life." "Please, I have a son. I have a 5-year-old son at home. He's sick, he needs me. I don't even know what I supposedly saw. I saw a man taking a shower. That's it. That's all I saw." Kang studied her the way a man studies a hand of cards he doesn't trust, searching for the tell, the flinch, the lie hiding underneath the fear. But there was something in the way she said the word son, a small crack of raw terror that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with a child she was picturing in that exact moment, that didn't match the profile of anyone trained to lie under pressure. Still, he couldn't take the risk. Not with everything already falling apart around him. Take her phone, he said. Check it. Everything, texts, calls, photos, apps. If there is one message, one photo, one recording that shouldn't be there, we will know. They took her phone. Grace didn't fight it. Fighting felt like the fastest way to die. She sat in that chair for 11 minutes. She would remember counting every one of them later, while Tae-sung scrolled through years of her private life, photos of Mateo in a hospital bed, half-bald from chemo, grinning anyway, a folder of unpaid bills photographed for her own records, a voice memo of her humming a lullaby to help her sleep because some nights the silence in her apartment felt too loud to bear alone. Nothing, Tae-sung finally said, sounding almost disappointed. She's clean. Kang exhaled slowly, some of the tension leaving his shoulders, though his eyes never fully softened. He crouched slightly so he was closer to her eye level, not a threat now, but something almost gentler, though still edged with steel. I am going to ask you something, and I need you to understand that your honest answer is the only thing that keeps you safe tonight, he said. Do you understand? Grace nodded, unable to speak. Have you told anyone what you saw? Called anyone? Texted anyone since you walked through that door? No. No, I promise. I haven't touched anything. I haven't told a single soul. And you won't. It wasn't a question. I won't, she whispered. I have a son. I just want to go home to my son. Something shifted behind Kang's eyes at those words, something that looked almost like memory, like a door he kept locked most days creaking open half an inch. He straightened up and turned away from her, staring out the window at the glittering skyline of a city that had no idea what almost happened 40 floors above its streets. Give her the phone back, he said. Let her go. Sir, Tae-sung started. I said let her go. He didn't turn around. But watch her. Quietly. If she is who she says she is, nothing happens to her. If I am wrong about her. He let the sentence hang in the air, unfinished, and somehow that was worse than any threat he could have spoken aloud. Grace was escorted to the service elevator by a silent man twice her size, her legs barely holding her weight, her mind screaming at her to run the second the doors opened, and yet some instinct, the same instinct that had made her freeze instead of scream a second time in that room, told her that running was exactly the wrong move. She went home that night and did not sleep. She sat on the edge of Mateo's bed, watching the soft rise and fall of his small chest, and thought, nobody would ever believe what almost happened to me tonight. Nobody can ever know. She was wrong about that too. Because somebody already knew. And that somebody was about to make her life a great deal more complicated. In the days that followed, Grace called her older sister, Nora, who lived 4 hours away in Bakersfield with 2 kids of her own and a husband who worked nights at a distribution warehouse. Grace didn't tell her the truth. How could she tell anyone the truth? But she asked, carefully, in the roundabout way people ask for help when they can't name what kind of help they actually need, whether Nora might be able to take Mateo for a week or 2, just in case, just for a little while. Is everything okay? Nora asked, the particular sharpness in her voice that only older sisters develop, the one built from a lifetime of knowing exactly when Grace was hiding something. You sound strange. You've sounded strange for days. I'm just tired, Grace said. Work's been a lot. Grace. I'm fine, Nora. I promise. I just want him somewhere safe if things get. She stopped herself before the sentence finished, aware of how it sounded, aware that she had no way to explain it that wouldn't terrify her sister far more than the vague explanation she was offering now. If things get hectic. That's all. Nora didn't push, not that night, though Grace could hear the worry sitting unspoken on the other end of the line, the way it always did between 2 sisters who'd learned, growing up in a house with too little money and too much silence, that some fears were better carried alone than spoken aloud where they might become real. In the end, Grace decided against sending Mateo away. Some instinct, maybe a mother's instinct, maybe simple stubbornness, told her that keeping him close, keeping her eyes on him every hour she possibly could, felt safer than trusting his safety to distance alone. At work, she started noticing things she had never had reason to notice before. A car, parked across the street from her apartment 2 mornings in a row, empty each time she looked twice. A delivery man who lingered a beat too long near her mailbox. A missed call from a block number that left no voicemail. None of it was necessarily anything. All of it felt like everything. She told Priya, finally, on a slow Wednesday afternoon while they polished silverware nobody would notice was polished, a stripped-down, careful version of the truth, that she'd accidentally interrupted something at a private event weeks earlier, something she wasn't supposed to see, and that she'd been feeling watched ever since. Priya set down the fork she was holding. Watched how? Like, someone following you watched, or you're just exhausted and anxious watched? Because those are different things, Grace, and I need you to be honest with me about which one this is. I don't know, Grace admitted, and hearing herself say it out loud, hearing how thin and frightened her own voice sounded, made something in her chest tighten painfully. I really don't know, Priya. I think I might be in trouble. I don't even understand what kind of trouble. I just know I can't stop feeling like something's coming, and I don't know how to prepare for something I can't name. Do you need to go to the police? And say what? That a man I can't identify, at an event I'm not supposed to talk about, might be having me watched for reasons I don't understand? They'll think I'm having a breakdown. Are you having a breakdown? Grace laughed, a small, broken sound, more air than humor. Maybe. Is that an option? Can I just quietly have a breakdown somewhere private and come back when it's over? Priya reached across the break room table and took her hand, the gesture simple and grounding in a way Grace hadn't realized she needed until it happened. You are the strongest person I know, Priya said. But strong doesn't mean alone, Grace. Whatever this is, you don't have to carry it by yourself. I mean that. Grace squeezed her hand back and said nothing, because the truth, the real truth, the one she couldn't share even with the person she trusted most in the world, was that she had no idea yet how literally, how completely, she was about to be forced to stop carrying it alone. 3 days later, Denise called Grace into her office with a look on her face that made Grace's stomach drop before a single word was spoken. I need you to explain something to me, Denise said, sliding a printed memo across the desk. Corporate wants you moved off the top floor events. Effective immediately. No explanation given. Just reassigned. Did you do something up there? Grace's mouth went dry. No. Nothing. I don't even know what you mean. Because this memo didn't come from our building management, Grace. It came from a private security firm that apparently has some kind of standing arrangement with the hotel for certain floors. I've worked here 12 years and I didn't even know that arrangement existed until this morning. Denise's eyes narrowed, sharp and suspicious, but not unkind. You're not in trouble. I just need to know if I need to be worried about you. I'm fine, Grace lied, forcing a smile that felt like glass on her face. Probably just a scheduling thing. She spent that night convinced they were watching her, that somewhere, some silent man in a dark car was parked outside her apartment building, waiting for her to make one wrong move. She barely ate. She barely slept. She jumped at every knock, every unfamiliar car engine outside her window. What she didn't know was that Kong had, in fact, quietly reassigned her away from anything connected to his private business, not to punish her, but almost, though he would never have admitted this even to himself, to protect her. Because in the 2 weeks that followed their encounter, 3 more pieces of sensitive information leaked to the Choi family, and Kong was becoming certain of something that terrified him more than any rival ever could. The traitor wasn't some outside spy. The traitor was inside his own house. If you think this is getting intense, just wait, because in a moment we're about to reach the part of this story where everything changes, where a decision is made that can never be undone. But before that, if this story has your heart racing right now, type "I'm still watching" in the comments below. Let's see who makes it all the way to the end with us. The traitor's name was Daniel Cho, and for 9 years he had been the closest thing Min Jun Kang had to a brother. They had grown up 2 streets apart in Incheon, sons of men who worked together, played baduk together, drank together on Friday nights while their wives cooked side by side in cramped kitchens. When Kang's parents died in that car explosion, it was 17-year-old Daniel who sat with him through 3 sleepless nights, who didn't say a single word of comfort because there were no words, who simply stayed. When Kang inherited his father's empire at 26, unprepared and terrified beneath a mask of icy composure, it was Daniel who stood beside him, who learned the business at his side, who eventually became his second-in-command, the one man in the organization Kang trusted with everything. What Kang did not know, what nobody knew, because Daniel had buried it so deep for so long, was that 6 years ago, Daniel's younger sister, Soo-min, had died in a warehouse fire that started during a deal gone wrong. A deal that Kang himself had personally approved, one small decision among thousands he made that year, one he barely remembered making. Soo-min had not been part of the business. She'd simply been in the wrong warehouse, delivering food to her boyfriend, one of Kang's low-level runners, on the exact night everything went up in flames. Kang had grieved her death. He had paid for her funeral. He had told Daniel, with what he believed was genuine sincerity, that he was sorry, that it should never have happened, that he would make sure nothing like it ever happened again. But an apology, however sincere, does not bring a sister back. And somewhere in the 6 years since, grief had curdled inside Daniel Cho into something colder, something patient, something that smiled at Kang's side every single day while quietly, methodically, feeding pieces of his empire to the one family capable of tearing it apart. Daniel didn't want money. The choice were paying him plenty, but that was never the point. What Daniel wanted was for Min Jun Kang to lose everything the way he had lost everything, slowly, piece by piece, watching it all slip through his fingers until there was nothing left to hold on to. 2 nights after the incident in the hotel suite, Daniel sat in the back booth of a quiet noodle shop in Koreatown that stayed open until 3 a.m. specifically for people who preferred to have conversations no one else could overhear. Across from him sat a woman named Ji-won Choi, the youngest daughter of the family patriarch, sharp-eyed and unreadable, who had taken over the family's day-to-day operations after her father's stroke 2 years earlier. "You're nervous tonight," Ji-won said, not looking up from her tea. "You've never been nervous before." "Someone walked in on Kang at the hotel," Daniel said quietly. "A hotel employee. He thinks it might be connected to the leaks." "Is it?" "No. She's nobody. An event coordinator. Wrong place, wrong time, nothing more." He turned his glass in a slow circle on the table, watching the light catch the ice. "But it's made him careful. More careful than usual. If he starts looking too closely at the people around him instead of outside threats, this gets harder for both of us." Ji-won studied him for a long moment, the kind of look that made most men in Daniel's line of work deeply uncomfortable, though Daniel had long since stopped being uncomfortable around anything. "You understand," she said, "that once this reaches a certain point, there's no walking it back. My father spent 30 years at war with Kang's father. I have spent 2 years rebuilding what that war cost us because you decided to hand me a shortcut. If you lose your nerve halfway through, you don't just endanger yourself. You endanger everyone who's trusted you enough to move on your information." "I haven't lost my nerve," Daniel said. "I lost my sister. There's a difference. Losing your nerve is something that happens to people who still have something left to be afraid of losing." Ji-won said nothing for a moment, and something almost like understanding, almost like sympathy, crossed her face before she buried it again beneath the careful mask she wore in every room that mattered. "Then let's finish what you started," she said. "Because Min Jun Kang has spent 16 years thinking grief only happens to other people. I think it's time he learned otherwise." Grace Delgado, at that exact hour, was 3 miles away, sitting on the edge of her son's bed, humming a lullaby to a boy who had no idea that 2 strangers in a noodle shop had just decided, in a conversation that would never once mention her name, to accelerate a war that was about to reshape the rest of her life. It happened almost by accident, the way most disasters do. 2 months after the incident in the hotel room, Grace, despite the reassignment, was pulled back into top-floor events for one single night because the hotel was short-staffed and desperate. A private dinner for 12, booked under a shell company name, paid in cash for the entire top floor. She didn't know who it was for until she walked into the private dining room with a tray of appetizers and saw him again. Kong. Their eyes met across the room, and for a moment neither of them moved. Then he gave the smallest, almost imperceptible nod, an acknowledgement, not quite a welcome, and returned to his conversation as though nothing had happened. Grace served that dinner with her hands trembling so badly she nearly dropped a bottle of wine twice. She kept her eyes down, her voice professional, her presence as invisible as she could possibly make it. She heard fragments of conversation she didn't understand, numbers, shipping routes, a name repeated several times, Choi, spoken with the kind of weight that made the whole table go quiet each time. She also noticed something else. Something small. Something that, 6 months earlier, she would never have thought twice about. Daniel Cho excused himself twice during the dinner to take phone calls in the hallway. The second time, Grace was refilling water glasses near the door and heard, through the gap, for words spoken in a low, urgent voice, "The shipment moves Thursday." It meant nothing to her. She didn't know what shipment, what Thursday, what any of it referred to. She filed it away in the exhausted, overloaded back of her mind alongside 100 other overheard fragments of other people's important lives, and went home to her son, and thought no more of it. But 3 days later, on Thursday night, a shipment belonging to Kong International Trading was intercepted on the 110 freeway by men working for the Choi family. 2 of Kang's men were hospitalized. Cargo worth just under $4 million vanished into the night. And Kong, reviewing the guest list and staff roster from that private dinner with the cold precision of a man who trusted almost no one anymore, found exactly one name that connected to both that room and a level of access that made his blood run cold. Grace Delgado. Because everyone else in that room, he had known for years. Grace was the only new variable. The only person who didn't belong in the pattern he thought he understood. He was wrong. But he didn't know that yet. And the mistake he was about to make would put Grace Delgado's life in more danger than she had ever imagined possible, all because the real traitor was standing close enough to point the finger somewhere else. We are getting close to the most intense part of this story, and if you've made it this far, you clearly love a good mystery. Make sure to like this video right now, it genuinely helps this story reach more people who need to hear it. Now, let's find out what happens when an innocent woman becomes the prime suspect in a war she never asked to be part of. They came for her on a Tuesday night, while she was helping Mateo with a puzzle on the living room floor, both of them laughing at a piece that clearly didn't fit no matter how many times he tried to force it. The knock at the door was polite. Almost gentle. That was somehow the most frightening part. "Mrs. Delgado," said the man standing in her doorway, not Tae-sung, someone else, someone she didn't recognize, wearing a suit too expensive for a simple visit. "Mr. Khan would like a word. Now would be preferable." "I have my son here," Grace said immediately, positioning herself instinctively between the doorway and Mateo. "I'm not leaving him alone. A car will take you both. Your son will be perfectly safe." Mr. Khan was very specific about that. There was no version of this where saying no felt like an option. Grace packed a small bag with trembling hands, telling Mateo it was a special nighttime adventure, an early bedtime somewhere new, anything to keep the fear out of her voice for his sake. He believed her instantly, the way 5-year-olds believe almost anything, and that trust broke her heart a little more with every step toward the waiting car. They were taken not to the hotel this time, but to a private estate in the hills, all glass and stone and silence, where Mateo was gently but firmly led to a separate room by a kind-faced woman who promised him a movie and popcorn, while Grace was brought into a study where Min Jun Khan stood waiting, his face carved from something harder than she'd seen even in that hotel room. "You were in that dining room," he said without preamble. 3 days before my shipment was destroyed. 2 of my men are in the hospital tonight because of what happened after that dinner." "I didn't do anything," Grace said, her voice shaking but steady with the particular courage of a mother whose child is close enough to protect. "I served appetizers and refilled water glasses. That's all I did." Someone in that room told the Choi family exactly when and where my shipment would move. There were 12 people in that room. 11 of them I have trusted with my life for years. You are the only name I cannot account for. Then account for me, Grace said, something igniting in her that surprised even herself, not defiance exactly, but the refusal to be erased, to be blamed, to let this man destroy the fragile life she'd fought so hard to keep together for her son. Ask me anything. Search anything. I have nothing to hide because I did nothing. I'm not part of your world. I never wanted to be part of your world. I walked through the wrong door once, and every single thing that's happened to me since then has been because of that one accident, and I am so tired, Mr. Kong, I am so tired of being afraid of a life I never chose. Her voice cracked on the last words, and to her own horror, tears she'd been holding back for weeks finally broke free. Not tears of weakness. Tears of exhaustion, of a woman who had spent years holding everything together with nothing but sheer will, finally reaching the end of what she could carry alone. Khan said nothing for a long moment. He watched her cry the way he might watch a language he didn't fully understand but somehow still recognized, the grammar of genuine desperation, which, in his experience, very few people were skilled enough to fake convincingly. Why did you say the words "the shipment moves Thursday" meant nothing to you? He said slowly, when Taesung's surveillance confirmed you were standing near the hallway during Mr. Cho's second phone call that night. Grace blinked through her tears, confusion cutting through the fear. What? You heard something. My people confirmed it. Why did you never mention it? Because I didn't think it mattered. People say things on phones all the time. I don't. Wait. She stopped. Something cold moved through her chest as pieces began, slowly, to click into place. Wait. Who was on that call? I don't even know who made that call. I just heard someone in the hallway say those words. I assumed it was one of your men talking to you, or to each other. I didn't even see who it was. Kang's jaw tightened. Daniel Cho left the table twice that night. Both times, alone, in that hallway. The room went very still. You think, Grace said slowly, hardly daring to say it out loud, that the person on that call, the person who said the shipment was moving Thursday, might not have been reporting to you. Might have been reporting to them. Khan did not answer. But something in his face, a flicker, barely a flicker, quickly suppressed, told Grace she had just said the one thing he had refused, for 6 long weeks, to let himself fully consider. If this moment just gave you chills, you are not alone, and this is exactly the point in the story where everything starts to unravel. Before we continue into the most emotional part of this journey, drop a comment telling us who you think the real traitor is. And if you haven't already, subscribe now, because the next part of this story is the part nobody sees coming. Khan did not sleep that night. He sat alone in his study long after Grace and Mateo had been given a guest room and, against every instinct honed over 16 years of survival, guaranteed protection until morning. He replayed 9 years of memories with Daniel Cho, 9 years of loyalty, of shared grief, of a friendship he had believed was the one unbreakable thing in a life built entirely on things that broke. He thought about Su-min. He hadn't let himself think about her properly in years, had filed her death away in the same locked room where he kept his parents, his childhood, every soft thing that hurt too much to look at directly. He remembered, now, the way Daniel's eyes had changed after the funeral, not disappeared, not distant, but somehow colder, more careful, like a man rebuilding himself around a wound instead of healing it. He remembered, too, a conversation from 4 years ago that he had dismissed at the time as nothing more than grief talking. Daniel, 3 drinks in, staring at nothing, had said quietly, "Do you ever think about how much easier it would be if all of this just stopped existing? All of it. Everything our fathers built." Khan had laughed it off. Had said something about exhaustion, about a long week, about how they'd both feel differently after some sleep. He had not asked the follow-up question that, 16 years into running an empire built on reading people correctly, he should have known to ask. By dawn, he had made a decision that terrified him more than any rival family ever could. He would test Daniel. Directly. Personally. He would feed him a piece of false information, a fabricated shipment route, a fake time, a location that existed only in a conversation between the two of them, and wait to see whether the choice moved on it. If they did, there would be no more question. No more doubt. Just a truth he would have to face, and a decision he would have to make about the one person he had never imagined betraying him. Grace, meanwhile, spent the following days in a strange, suspended state, not free exactly, not a prisoner exactly, existing somewhere in the space between the two, in a beautiful house on a hill with a boy who thought it was the best adventure of his young life, and a mother who understood, with growing dread, that she had somehow become entangled in the middle of a war she never chose and could not simply walk away from. She and Khan spoke more in those days than either of them expected to. Not about the danger, mostly. About smaller things. He asked about Mateo's illness, and Grace found herself telling him things she hadn't told anyone in years, the terror of watching her son go through chemotherapy at 3 years old, the way she'd learned to smile through hospital hallways so he wouldn't see her fear, the specific, particular loneliness of holding an entire family together completely alone, night after night, with no one to share the weight. He listened in a way that surprised her, not offering easy comfort, not performing sympathy, just listening, the way a man listens when a story reminds him uncomfortably of his own. "My mother used to hum," he told her once, unprompted, staring out at the city lights below the estate. "When things were bad. I didn't understand it as a child. I thought it meant she wasn't afraid. Now I think it meant the opposite. I think it meant she was so afraid that humming was the only thing keeping her upright." Grace thought of her own late-night lullabies to Mateo, hummed not for him but for herself, and said nothing, because there was nothing that needed to be said. Some understandings don't require words. They simply exist, quietly, between two people who recognize the same kind of exhaustion in each other. It was not romance, not exactly, though something warmer than caution had begun, carefully, to grow in the space between them. It was something rarer, perhaps, two people who had each spent years being strong for everyone else, finally allowing themselves to be, for a few stolen hours, simply tired, simply human, in front of someone who understood exactly why. On the third night, unable to sleep, Grace found her way to the estate's kitchen at nearly 2 a.m., drawn by the small comfort of making tea the way her mother used to, and found Khan already there, sitting alone at the counter with a glass of water he wasn't drinking, staring at nothing. "Couldn't sleep either," she said, more statement than question. "I haven't slept properly in 3 weeks, he admitted, something in the late hour and the emptiness of the room loosening whatever careful control he usually kept over his own words. "Every time I close my eyes, I run through the list again. Everyone who has access to information that's been leaking. Everyone I've trusted for years. I keep hoping if I go through it enough times, a name will finally feel wrong in a way it hasn't felt wrong yet." "And does it?" He was quiet for a long moment. "There's one name I keep skipping over," he admitted. "Every single time. I tell myself it's because it doesn't fit the pattern. But I think, if I am honest with myself, it's because I don't want it to be true, and some part of me is protecting myself from looking at it directly." "That's usually how it works," Grace said, sitting down across from him, wrapping her hands around a mug she hadn't gotten around to filling. "The people closest to us are the hardest to suspect, precisely because we need them not to be capable of it. I used to do that with my ex-husband. Ignored so many things because admitting what they meant would have meant admitting I'd built a whole life on a foundation that wasn't real." Khan looked at her properly then, something shifting in his expression. "You've never mentioned a husband." "Ex-husband. He left about 8 months after Mateo's diagnosis. Said he couldn't do this, like I had a choice to opt out too. Like being Mateo's mother was a decision I could reconsider once things got hard." She laughed, short and without much humor. "I used to make excuses for him too. Told myself he just needed time, that grief affects people differently, that he'd come back around. He didn't. And I spent a long time being angry at myself for not seeing it sooner, when really, I think I saw it plenty clearly. I just didn't want it to be true yet." "What changed?" "Mateo got sicker before he got better. There wasn't room left in me for pretending anymore. Some situations force the truth out of you whether you're ready for it or not. She met his eyes steadily. I think that's where you are right now, Mr. Kong. I think you already know the name. I think you're just waiting for something to force it out of you, the way my life forced it out of me. He didn't answer that directly, but something in his silence told her she'd struck closer to the truth than either of them was fully prepared to say aloud. He looked down at the glass of water in his hands, turning it slowly, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter than she'd ever heard it. My father used to say that the men who destroy you are rarely strangers. They're the men who know exactly where you keep your softest places, because you showed them yourself, a long time ago, back when you still trusted them enough to be soft in front of anyone at all. He set the glass down. I didn't understand what he meant until tonight. I think I've understood it for weeks, actually. I just didn't want to say his name out loud and make it real. Grace didn't ask who he was. She understood, with the particular clarity that comes at 2 a.m. between two exhausted people finally being honest with each other, that Kong wasn't ready to speak the name yet, and that when he finally did, everything would change. She simply reached across the counter and rested her hand briefly over his, not a romantic gesture, not yet, just the simple human comfort of one tired person acknowledging another, and said nothing more, because sometimes the kindest thing you can offer someone standing at the edge of an unbearable truth is simply not to rush them toward it before they're ready to jump. On the 4th night, Kong set his trap. He told Daniel, in a quiet, private conversation meant for no other ears, that a shipment worth $6 million would move through the old pier warehouse at midnight on Friday, a route that did not exist, a shipment that was not real, a location chosen specifically because only one other living person, planted deliberately by Kong, would also hear that same false information from a completely different source, ensuring that if it leaked, he would know precisely which direction it had traveled. Friday night, Kong sat in a dark car 3 blocks from the empty pier warehouse, Taesung silent beside him, both of them watching a street that should have had no reason for anyone to appear on it. At 11:52 p.m., 2 black SUVs pulled up outside the warehouse. 6 armed men stepped out, moving with the precision of people who believed they were about to intercept a fortune. Kong closed his eyes for exactly 1 second. When he opened them again, something in his face had changed permanently, not shock, because some quiet, buried part of him had known for days, maybe longer, maybe years. Just grief. Old, familiar grief, arriving right on schedule. Bring him to me, he said quietly. Alive. And bring me the truth, whatever it costs. This is the moment everything comes crashing together, the moment 9 years of loyalty collides with 6 years of hidden grief. If your heart is racing right now, you are exactly where this story wants you. Stay with us, because what happens in the next few minutes will completely change how you see everyone in this story, including the man you thought was simply a villain. Daniel Cho did not run when they came for him. He simply set down the glass of whiskey he'd been holding, looked at the 2 men standing in his doorway, and said, with something almost like relief, "Took you long enough." He was brought to the estate in the hills just after 1 a.m., not restrained, not blindfolded, walking of his own will into the study where Min Jun Kong stood waiting, exactly as he had stood waiting for Grace 2 months earlier, except this time, there was no uncertainty in his eyes. Only the exhausted, hollow steadiness of a man finally facing something he had spent years running toward without admitting it. 9 years, Kong said quietly. 9 years, Daniel. My brother. My family. And you sold every piece of it to the people who would have burned it to the ground. I didn't sell it for money, Daniel said. You already know that, or you wouldn't look so tired instead of so angry. Then tell me why. Daniel's composure finally cracked, just slightly, just enough to let 6 years of buried grief bleed through the surface he'd built over it. You approved that deal, Min Jun. The warehouse. You signed off on it in 9 seconds between 2 other meetings, because it was nothing to you, a small shipment, low risk, low priority. You didn't even remember making that decision until I reminded you of it 2 years later. But that decision killed my sister. She was 22 years old. She was bringing dinner to a boy who barely deserved her, in a building that turned into a furnace because your organization cut corners on safety to save $11,000. $11,000, Min June. That's what her life was worth in your ledger. The room was silent except for the low hum of the city outside the windows. I grieved her, Kong said, his voice rougher than Grace, standing frozen in the doorway where she'd followed without being noticed, had ever heard it. I paid for everything. I told you. You told me you were sorry, Daniel said. And then you went back to running the same empire, making the same calculations, treating people's lives as numbers in a ledger, exactly as you did before. Nothing changed. Nothing except the size of the hole in my chest where my sister used to be. He laughed, a broken, humorless sound. I told myself for a year that I would let it go. Then 2 years. Then I stopped telling myself anything and just started making calls. It was easier than I expected. Grief makes you very patient, Min June. It makes you willing to wait a very long time for something to finally break. Grace, still unnoticed in the doorway, felt something in her chest ache in a way she hadn't expected, not sympathy for what Daniel had done, which had put innocent people, herself included, in genuine danger, but a recognition, deep and uncomfortable, of the particular corrosion that unaddressed grief could carve into a person over years of silence. You let them come after her, Kong said suddenly, turning slightly, and Grace realized with a jolt that he meant her, that he had known she was standing there the entire time. You let them believe she might be the leak. You let me nearly destroy an innocent woman's life to cover your own tracks. She was convenient, Daniel admitted, without shame, without apology. I needed someone new in the pattern to draw suspicion away from someone who'd always been there. I didn't think it would go as far as it did. I'm not proud of that part. She has nothing to do with any of this. No, Kong said quietly. She doesn't. And she has spent 2 months living in fear because of a war that was never hers, started by grief that was never resolved, over a decision I made in 9 careless seconds 9 years ago. He turned fully now, facing Daniel completely. You wanted me to understand what it feels like to lose everything the way you lost her. Congratulations, Daniel. I think, for the first time in a very long time, I finally do. What happened next, Grace would later describe, when she finally, years afterward, found herself able to tell this story to anyone at all, as the moment that taught her the truth at the center of everything, that revenge and grief so often were the exact same face, and that the line between a man who destroys and a man who protects is thinner, and more human, than anyone ever wants to admit. Kong did not kill Daniel Cho that night. He had every justification, every precedent within the world he'd inherited, every reason to make an example that would ripple through his organization for years. Instead, he stood in silence for a long moment, staring at the man who had been his brother, and said something that surprised everyone in that room, including, perhaps, himself. I am done, he said quietly. I am done building an empire on ledgers that treat human lives as acceptable losses. I am done pretending that grief like yours doesn't exist just because I never let myself look at it directly. You will not be harmed. But you will never work for me again, and you will tell the Choi family everything they need to hear to believe this war between us is finished, because it is. I am ending it. Tonight. Daniel stared at him, stunned into a silence that lasted almost a full minute. You're just letting me go? I am giving you what I should have given you 6 years ago, Kong said. The truth, spoken directly, instead of buried under an apology that meant nothing because nothing behind it ever changed. I am sorry about Sumin. I have been sorry for 6 years. I am sorry it took watching you destroy nearly everything I built to finally understand that being sorry was never enough. Daniel stood in the middle of that study for a long moment, looking, for the first time since Grace had known of him, less like a man capable of orchestrating a war and more like exactly what he was underneath all of it, a grieving older brother who had run out of anywhere else to put 6 years of unbearable weight. His shoulders dropped. His hands, which had been clenched at his sides since he walked in, finally uncurled. She used to sing, Daniel said quietly, apropos of nothing, the way grief sometimes surfaces sideways when it can no longer be held down directly. Sumin, terribly. She had the worst voice of anyone I've ever known, and she sang constantly anyway, in the shower, in the car, doing dishes, like it never once occurred to her that she should be embarrassed about it. He laughed, and this time it wasn't hollow, just sad, just human. I used to tease her about it. I would give anything, Minjun. Anything at all, to hear her sing off-key one more time. I know, Kang said quietly. I know there's nothing that fixes that. I'm not asking you to forgive me for it. I'm only telling you that I finally understand what I took from you, and that understanding at 6 years too late doesn't make it any less true now. Grace, watching from the doorway, felt tears sliding down her face without having noticed the moment they started. Not for herself, not for the dangers she'd survived, but for two men standing in the wreckage of 9 years of brotherhood, finally, achingly, telling each other the truth that might have saved all of it if either of them had found the courage to speak it years earlier. Taesung escorted Daniel out sometime after 3 a.m., not as a prisoner, but as a man walking, unsteadily, toward whatever came next in a life he would now have to entirely rebuild. He paused at the door and looked back once, not at Kang, but at Grace. I am sorry, he told her simply. For what it's worth. You didn't deserve any of what I put you through. I hope your son grows up never knowing how close he came to losing you over something that had nothing to do with either of you. Grace didn't say it was okay, because it wasn't, not entirely, not yet. But she nodded, because she understood grief well enough by then to recognize it even when it wore a stranger's face, and because some part of her, the same part that had spent years finding compassion for hospital staff, insurance clerks, and exhausted strangers who had nothing to do with her son's illness and everything to do with the world's general capacity for carelessness, could not quite bring herself to hate a man who had simply broken under a weight most people never have to carry at all. This is the part of the story where everything the video promised finally arrives, the twist, the truth, and the lesson underneath it all. If this story has moved you even a little, this next part is exactly why we tell stories like this one. Stay with us until the very end. In the weeks that followed, the empire Min Jun Kang had inherited began, quietly and deliberately, to change shape. He severed the illegal portions of the business entirely, the smuggling routes, the underground contracts, the arrangements that had made his father wealthy and his father's enemies dangerous. He kept only the legitimate import-export operations, rebuilt from the ground up with actual safety standards, actual fair wages, actual accountability, the kind of business his father, Grace once suggested gently, might have secretly wished he'd had the courage to build all along. It was not an easy transition. Some of his old associates left in anger, feeling betrayed by a man choosing weakness, as they saw it, over power. A few threats came in the early weeks, quickly and firmly handled by men still loyal to Kang for reasons that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with genuine respect, earned over years, for a leader finally choosing to become someone worth following rather than someone worth fearing. The Choi family, true to Daniel's word, stood down. Whatever old grievance had fueled their war with Kang's father seemed to lose its fuel the moment Kang himself stopped giving them a reason to fight, proof, perhaps, of something Grace had come to believe deeply over the course of those strange, frightening months, that most cycles of violence continue not because anyone truly wants them to, but because no one involved believes they're allowed to be the one who stops. As for Grace and Mateo, Kang kept a promise he made quietly, without ceremony, on the same night everything finally came undone. Mateo's medical debts, the crushing weight that had kept Grace awake for 2 years straight, were paid in full, not as a bribe, not as hush money, but as what Kang called, simply, correcting an imbalance the world never should have allowed to exist. Grace resisted at first. She did not want charity, did not want to feel indebted to a man whose world had cost her 2 months of genuine terror, but Kang was patient in a way she hadn't expected from him, explaining gently that this wasn't about erasing what had happened, only about making sure it never happened to her again in some other form, some other crisis, some other night she couldn't afford. She was offered a position, eventually, managing logistics for the newly legitimate Kang International Trading, a real job, with real hours, real security, and a salary that meant she never again had to choose between rent and Mateo's follow-up appointments. She took it, not because of what had happened between her and Kang in those strange in-between weeks, though something had grown there, quiet and real, something neither of them rushed to name. She took it because, for the first time in years, she was being offered a future built on stability instead of survival, and she had fought too hard, for too long, to turn that down out of pride. Mateo, now 6, still talks sometimes about the big house on the hill and the popcorn movie night, with the simple, uncomplicated joy of a child who never knew how close his mother came to losing everything, and never needs to know. Some stories are carried quietly by the people who live them, so that the children who survive them get to keep their innocence a little longer. 6 months after that night in the study, Mateo had his first fully clear scan, no shadows, no markers, nothing but a radiologist's quiet, unremarkable confirmation that the disease that had haunted 3 years of his short life had, for now, truly retreated. Grace cried in the parking lot afterward, the same parking lot ritual she performed so many times before, except this time the tears came from something other than fear, and when she finally composed herself and drove home, there was no debt collector's letter waiting in the mailbox, no anxious calculation of which bill could wait another month. There was only Mateo, chattering in the back seat about a superhero movie he wanted to watch to celebrate, utterly unaware that his mother was celebrating something far larger than he could yet understand. She called Kong that evening, almost without thinking about it, the habit of sharing small victories with him having grown, quietly, into something neither of them examined too closely. "Clear scan," she said, when he picked up. "Completely clear." There was a pause on the line, and when he spoke again, his voice carried something she rarely heard in it, an unguarded warmth that had nothing to do with business, with power, with any of the calculations that had governed his life for 16 years. "That is the best news I have heard in longer than I can remember," he said. "Tell him I said congratulations. Tell him he's earned a very large ice cream." "You could tell him yourself," Grace said, surprising herself with the ease of the invitation. "He asks about you sometimes. He still thinks you're the man from the big house. He doesn't know what you actually do. He just knows you gave him popcorn and let him win at chess twice in a row, badly, and unconvincingly, I might add." Khan laughed, a real laugh, rare and unguarded, the kind Grace had only heard a handful of times in all the months she'd known him. "I let him win because he is 5. 6 now. And he knows you let him win. He's not as easily fooled as you think. Then he takes after his mother," Khan said, and something in the way he said it made Grace's chest tighten with a feeling she still wasn't ready to name out loud. Not yet, maybe not for a while, but a feeling that was there nonetheless, steady and warm and entirely unexpected in a life that had, for so long, left no room for anything except survival. They met in person 2 days later, at a small park near Grace's apartment, because Kong had asked, almost shyly for a man who commanded rooms full of powerful people without effort, whether he might be allowed to bring the promised ice cream himself. Mateo took to him instantly and without complication, the way children often do with adults who choose to actually get down on the ground and play rather than simply performing kindness from a comfortable distance. They spent 40 minutes constructing an elaborate, physically improbable sandcastle in the park's small sandbox while Grace watched from a nearby bench, arms wrapped around her knees, feeling something in her chest that she hadn't let herself feel in years, not relief exactly, and not quite happiness either, but something adjacent to both, something like permission. "He's a good kid," Khan said later, brushing sand from his very expensive trousers with the resigned good humor of a man who clearly didn't mind the cost. "Sharper than he lets on. He beat me twice at a card game I invented on the spot, and I'm fairly certain he cheated both times." "He absolutely cheated both times," Grace confirmed. "He gets that from his Aunt Nora, not from me." "I look forward to meeting the woman responsible," Khan said, and there was something easy in it, something that sounded, for the first time since Grace had known him, like a man imagining a future rather than simply managing a present built entirely out of survival. Grace didn't know, that afternoon in the park, exactly what shape her life would take from there, whether whatever was quietly growing between her and this complicated, reformed, still healing man would become something lasting, or simply remain the strange, precious friendship that had carried both of them through the worst months of their lives. She didn't need to know yet. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she let herself simply exist in a good moment without immediately bracing for the next disaster, watching her son shriek with laughter over a collapsing sandcastle, under a sky that, for once, held no threat in it at all. Priya was the one who finally said it plainly, months later, over the same terrible break-room coffee that had witnessed the earliest chapters of this entire story. "You know you're allowed to be happy about this, right?" she said, watching Grace's face light up at a text notification she quickly tried to hide. "After everything you went through, after everything you survived, you're allowed to let something good happen to you too. It doesn't cancel out how hard the rest of it was. It doesn't mean it wasn't real or that it didn't matter. It just means the story didn't end where you thought it might." "I keep waiting for something to go wrong," Grace admitted. "I think some part of me got so used to bracing for the next disaster that I don't know what to do with a season where nothing's on fire." "Then let it not be on fire," Priya said simply. "For once. Just let it be good." Denise, for her part, never learned the full truth of what had happened during those strange months when Grace was quietly reassigned and then quietly returned, though she noticed a change in her, a settledness that hadn't been there before, a woman who no longer flinched quite so hard at unexpected phone calls, who laughed a little more easily in the break room, who seemed, in some fundamental way, lighter than the exhausted employee who had walked those halls for 6 years. "Whatever happened to you," Denise said once, apropos of nothing, watching Grace confidently talk down an irate father of the bride over a seating chart dispute, "it's like you finally stopped carrying the whole building on your shoulders alone." "Good. You were never actually supposed to carry it alone. None of us are." Grace never told her how right she was, or how literally that sentence applied to far more than just a hotel. Some truths are better left as quiet understandings between people who don't need every detail spelled out to recognize a change when they see it. Grace still works at the Palacio Grand occasionally, on special events, though her real career now lives somewhere else entirely, a life she never imagined for herself the night she opened a door she should have left closed. She thinks sometimes about the version of that night where she simply screamed, or ran, or panicked in some way that ended everything before it began. She thinks about how close that moment came to becoming a tragedy instead of a turning point, and how the only thing standing between the two, in the end, was one honest woman refusing to be anything other than exactly who she was, even with a stranger's hand reaching towards something metal on a nightstand. As for Min Jun Kong, the man once known only as the Ghost, feared in rooms he never entered, powerful in ways most people never fully understood, he says, now, that the most important lesson of his life did not come from 16 years of running an empire, or from any of the wars he fought to protect it. It came from a woman who accidentally walked through the wrong door, looked him directly in the eye, and refused to let fear turn her into someone she wasn't. "She taught me," he said once, quietly, to no one in particular, that the truth, spoken plainly, is the only thing strong enough to survive contact with power. Everything else, every lie, every threat, every empire built on silence, eventually collapses under its own weight. But the truth just stays. It waits. And eventually, it finds the door. Tae-sung, who had spent 9 years standing guard over an empire built on secrecy and fear, found himself, in the months after that night, adjusting to a version of Min Jun Kong he barely recognized, a man who asked after employees' families, who insisted on fair severance for the handful of people who chose to leave rather than adapt to the new way of doing things, who once spent an entire afternoon on the phone personally ensuring a dock worker's injured hand was properly covered by insurance instead of quietly paid off and forgotten, the way such things had always been handled before. "You've gone soft," Tae-sung told him once, though there was no real complaint in it, only the dry observation of a man who had earned the right to speak plainly after 9 years of loyal service. "I've gone honest," Kong corrected. "There's a difference, even if it looks the same from the outside. Soft is pretending problems don't exist. This is choosing to actually solve them instead of burying them somewhere they'll fester for another 6 years and come back twice as dangerous." Tae-sung considered that for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "My daughter asked me last week what kind of company I work for," he admitted. "First time in 9 years I didn't feel strange answering her." Kong said nothing, but something in his face suggested that single sentence meant more to him than any profit margin the old empire had ever produced. And that, perhaps, is the real story underneath this one, not a woman who stumbled into danger, and not a powerful man who almost made a terrible mistake, but a simple, quiet truth that both of them discovered, separately, in their own ways, on the same impossible night, that the people we fear the most are so often just as lost, just as grieving, just as human as the people we're afraid of becoming. And sometimes, the bravest thing anyone can do is refuse to let that fear decide who they turn into. If this story moved you even a little, that means it did exactly what it was meant to do. Before you go, make sure you're subscribed so you never miss the next story like this one, and drop a comment below telling us which part hit you the hardest. Was it the hook? The twist? The ending? We read every single one. Thank you for staying until the very end. We'll see you in the next story.